Hi.
Hi. Are we introducing ourselves?
Yeah, I'm going to start actually, and then yes, definitely. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to get to know each other. So, welcome, a very warm welcome to all of you to our conversations on social reproduction. I can't tell you how delighted I am today to be hosting this discussion on the new translation of Leopoldina Fortunati's book, The Arcana of Reproduction, Housewives, Prostitutes, Workers and Capital, published by Verso Books. Leopoldina actually doesn't need an introduction, but for some of our younger colleagues, I just want to share that she's a senior professor of sociology of communication and culture at the University of Udine, where she has founded the NewMe Research Lab on new media. And she has authored prolifically. She has authored 6 books and 15 co-authored volumes, co-edited volumes, including most recently the Oxford Handbook of Mobile Communication, Culture and Information in 2020. And she was and she is a key figure in the Italian Wages for Housework campaign. And I just want to say that, I'm a huge fan of hers, as you will see. I came across her book, The Arcana of Reproduction, which is this version of it, which I hold on to quite religiously and have taught to my students. And I came across this when doing my research on sex work and trying to articulate a materialist feminist theory of sex work. And I have to say that amongst the numerous Marxist and materialist feminists who viewed sex work as, violence per se, or as trafficking per se, or as Mariamis called it sexploitation, I felt that Leopoldina was exceptional because she theorized how under capitalism, reproduction was divided into many sectors, with housework and sex work being the major ones. She spoke about how the boundaries that were drawn between them was a function of capitalism. She spoke about how sex work was productive work and why, despite the left's preoccupation with abolition, that abolition would only result in the persecution of sex workers and their entry into what she called forced wage relations at the lowest possible wage. And in her words, the fight against the criminalization of prostitution is every woman's struggle. So, sex workers in Marxist theory were just the lumpen proletariat, but Leopoldina offered a very sophisticated theorization of their labor, as work and as, their struggles as deserving feminist support. So I'm very grateful to her for her very brilliant book, which was truly exceptional for the time at which it was published and continues to be exceptional. So, of course, the revised version of the book offers an equally brilliant theorizing of housework. And so for this, we have invited her to speak to us on her new book, on her new translation of the book. And then we will have reflections offered by 3 readers. So we have Professor Gauri Vijaykumar, who's at Brandeis University. We have Shraddha Jain, who is doing her PhD at the Center for Development Studies in Thiruvananthapuram in India. And then we have Professor Donatella Alessandrini, who's from Loughborough Law School, and she was at Kent Law School, and she's a lawyer of international economic law. Emma Dowling, unfortunately, has teaching obligations, so she couldn't join us today. So we will have a presentation from Leopoldina and then from our readers, and then we will open it up to Q&A. So welcome, everyone. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prabha, and I must say that I'm a very fan of your work that I appreciate a lot. And thank you for this invitation to be with you all today. I thought to talk about the arcane to make 2 points in reality, quite, I don't know how to define them, but behind the arcane. The main the first point is this. The main argument of the Arcana is that housework is a form of productive labor, no? But why we devoted so many energies, so much energy to proving this? The reason was not theoretical, because for us to demonstrate if it was productive, reproductive, unproductive, or other thing was not important at that time, because we were within a cycle of struggles very intense that gave not us time to dedicate energy to theoretical disquisition, etc. But the reason was political. In the 70s, the feminist movement was very important to tear away the veil from the invisibility surrounding domestic labor. We must say that domestic labor was not considered a labor, was considered something, but not some activity, but was not having the dignity of a labor. So neither for women. So a lot of women were not able to say, to recognize in what they are doing a labor. And so the feminist movement was very instrumental, very important to give the dignity of labor to domestic labor. But the reaction of the left, the movement left was very important at that time. For us in Italy, we had the most powerful communist party in Europe, for example, was very important. They were a union, very important. They were also the radical left, very important. So the left was completely unprepared to deal with this topic, and they saw this topic in the classical Orthodox way. So their point of view was that it was unproductive. The left was not so different from the economical debate at that time, because economists had roughly three positions on this topic. Or the domestic labor was unproductive, was a pre-capitalist thing, or was a mode of production different from the capitalist system, but incorporated within the capitalist system. We don't know how, but this was the hypothesis. And the last one was that it was a natural activity. So starting from Marx, an orthodox vision of Marx, the domestic labor was considered unproductive. But saying this was to destine women to marginality, because those with did not productive works were considered marginal in respect to the class composition. So they were the political consequences that of this position that concerned us. And because of this, for example, women were excluded from the category of potentially revolutionary subjects. So domestic labor was not a labor. Women were not political actors. So they were not recognized as such. So women were considered not capable of expressing in effective struggles against the capitalist system. So what we can do was to support women, to cook for them, for those who were, who could fight against, really in an efficient way against the capital system, to cook, to support in many ways their struggles. So women were absolutely at the margin of the political activity, okay, but in the public sphere. As a result of this position, women could emancipate only escaping this marginal and non-productive position by entering the wage labor force. So go out, go to work in the factories, in the offices, etc. So women were encouraged by all the left forces to leave the home and join the real productive world of work. So with a wage in their hands, women were told they would overcome their economic dependence and remedy their insufficiency of capitalism relationship. No? They were in a position in which capital has not touched them profoundly, but only, sfiorate, I don't know how you say in English, but only touched very superficially. We were very offended, deeply offended as women by this political perspective, this vision. To male, that was not the complete picture. The other consequence was that to male workers, the left was proposing a radical struggle against the capitalist system. So the revolution, the revolution that could completely change the organization of society, of the way in which people produced, the way in which people lived. And although we must say that there has been over time by the left a lack of exercise in discussing this point. What can happen after the end of the capitalist system? How do we see society can work? But the accent, the interest was focused almost on the struggle more than what happens later on. So, but Marx, for example, did this small exercise saying in the communist society, when capitalism will be destroyed, we can go to fishing, hunting, etc. Our life will be full of, every sort of activity, the desire, expression of our creativity, etc. So to male workers, the proposal was this. So radical struggle, destruction of the mode of production, of capitalist mode of production, a revolution, completely radical change of society. And to women? To women, no, nothing of this, nothing of this. Women were not allowed to imagine domestic labor as something that could be liberated from capitalism and the way in which capitalism had organized the family, gender roles, practices of education, sexuality, and love. What the left proposed to women was a strategy of equal exploitation. So the maximum that women could conceive was to become equal to men in the exploitation. And this was a revolutionary objective. So it was so offensive for us to be treated in that way, that we the only way was to find our way to build our theory, build our analysis completely, not starting from zero, of course, but in a very autonomous way. This was very clear. Now, we must say that feminist movement at that time, a lot of women were tempted to start from zero, no? Because they said, all the political thinking before the feminist movement was polluted by male dominance, so it is completely not usable. We were not in that perspective. We believed profoundly that we could use, but we had to use what, for example, operaism and Marxist did, but in another way, in our way, from our point of view. And because for us, we were seeing that this strategy that the left, pardon?
It's okay. I think somebody's joining the call.
Okay, that this political perspective that the left was proposing to women was politically a disaster for women, no? Because was a disaster because women entry into the capitalist labor market was pursued without acknowledging the value of domestic labor. So they, in this perspective, completely ignored the existence of domestic labor. Domestic labor was a ghost. It was the invisible now for this strategy. So women were subjected to a double burden, no? The domestic work that continued to be done and the outside work. And then the other aspect was that women in workplaces were obliged to negotiate only half of them, half of their life, only the hours in which they were outside the home. But the life, the other part of their life, they couldn't talk about this. They couldn't negotiate anything about this. So completely, they put women in a situation completely weak also for the organization, the struggles, and in a situation in which the women working in the metal mechanical factories were separated by those working in the textiles, separated by those working on food factories, etc., etc. So a disaster. In contrast, we propose a wage for housework as a terrain of political struggle, which was a completely different strategy. First of all, domestic struggle is a terrain that unites all women, because women that have a work outside home or not, but all women do housework. So it was the place where to build a unit. Asking money for us was very important. Very important as a basis for personal autonomy and independence. But attention, because also the left said, go out from the house, you will have money for the work. No, we said, we already work. We want money for the work we already do, perform at home. This work must be negotiated. The value of this work must be recognized by the state, and we want to have our personal autonomy and independence through this work, through the recognition of this work, because we saw this perspective as a way to reclaim, at least part of the value produced by women, part of the wealth produced by women. This perspective was strengthening women's power to struggle in the workplace outside the home. Because, look, women, when they were going to the job market, they were in a place, in a situation completely regulated by men, born for men, regulated for men, etc. So it was a terrain in which they were completely the outside. Nothing of what was the situation of women was completely included inside that. That situation was for a really free worker, but women never could be a real free worker, was a half free worker, because there was the other part of their life that could not be included in that. And then it was this objective, wage for and against housework, was an objective, a revolutionary objective that wanted to inescate a process of liberation of women from not only the oppression, but also from the exploitation of women. All women, and here we always said houseworks and prostitutes, we have to be united in these in our struggles, because the one is the other face of the medal, but we are the both contribute to the same medal. And if we are accepted to be divided and to put ones against the others, capital will win. We will never be able to win and to liberate really our life from capital exploitation, which express in very different way through the housework and through the prostitution work. A last point, that we affirm the women. So when we talk about wage for housework, we said wage for housework, not wage for housework, for houseworker, but for housework, despite if it is a man, a woman, a child, an older adult who do housework. So it is the work that has to be paid, not the figure that currently now do that work, because to avoid the connection that is very very dear to the right of this work with women, this work with houseworker. Okay. We always said that our point of reference was women, houseworkers of working class, sex workers, workers, women that work in the shops, in the offices, in the school, in the hospitals, etc. So this kind of women, so the class women belonging to the class strata of the population. It is very important to clarify for a movement what is the point of reference, because, for example, feminist movement was largely at that time made by women, affluent women, journalist, professor, also women belonging to high-level classes, also employees, etc. But many of these women didn't have the problem of the housework, because very probably they were paying other women to do the work, the housework for them. For us, the problem was all that women that had to do this work by themselves, okay, had to do this work directly. Where we were also accused sometimes of essentialism, etc., was wrong. This accusation was wrong, because for us women, we considered the women as a subject, historically determined political subject. So the political subjects who are historically determined, nothing to do with biology, okay? And fully part of the class composition. And when the left was saying now you know, but there must be a technical position to become part of the political composition of class. We said, and so you cannot be part. And we said, you are completely right. Women are the subject with the greatest subservive potential. So the subject who can produce the most radical social subversion. It is to renew, expand this political project that we are organizing a gathering in Paris on May 21, 2022, about the relaunch of this political objective. However, much remains to be done. We must, I think we must launch a collective, general exercise to discuss the political perspective on the part of women on the society after the destruction of capital. Because it is very important, struggling with having in mind how we can conceptualize a society liberated from capital, which strategies can dismantle hierarchies of power while affirming the value of difference, because we must produce strategies about that. The stratification of class doesn't disappear like that. No, we must produce a strategy to destroy that. How to imagine non-capitalist form of education? Because we say, we are mother, a lot of us are mother, and we have children, male and female, and we have not, it is not a question of stereotypes only. It is something more, is the pressure of social roles that are very, very strong and against which we, but what are the strategies? We must discuss, we must give indication to young women that are mother and have children. How can we educate in another way our children? How can we reappropriate our sexuality after the distraction brought by commodification and the capitalist relationship? How can we take over the sexuality? How can we express another form of sexuality that will be not neither domestic, neither prostitution, another form? No? How can we? There are, this is points that need really a mass discussion. So engage a lot of energy, of imagination, of intelligence produced by women to elaborate all these points. The second point I would like to raise is the crucial importance of the political perspective from which we look at women. The Arcana was, I always said, it is a militant book where a lot of many hours of discussion among thousands of women was incorporated. The result of all these big collective public exercise by women was incorporated inside the Arcane. But the Arcane was written starting from the struggle of women. It is very important. The perspective must be always the struggle of women. We did so because, for example, we learned the lessons from Mario Tronti. Mario Tronti was an important operaist man that was in the left and was in the Communist Party, but he had a very interesting lecture of how we can read the history of working class. And he said exactly this. We must look at the struggle. Until Mario Tronti work, which came out in 1966, the historical materialism had depicted the working class as the sacrificial victim of capitalism, humanity, and cruelty. Okay, this was and Tronti said, I'm not convinced. He returned this vision by asserting that it was the opposite in reality. It was the working class that drives the initiative of capital. He said, if we wanted to understand the capital, look at the struggles of working class. Otherwise, you don't understand the capital. You cannot understand capital. And because for us, this was a very convincing work and vision, we tried to restore, to applicate also to women this perspective. So looking at the struggles of women to understand the political response by capital, no? How capital was planning in a future of its system in response to the struggle of women. Tronti was restoring a sense of political pride and agency to the working class, who discovered with him to be a central actor in the capitalist system. And we aimed to do the same with us, with the women, with our history, with our struggle. And so at the beginning of the feminist movement, in the 70s, it made sense, in a certain sense, this collective recognition of women as a victim, no, of social injustice and systemic violence, etc., because it was the first step in order to react and begin to fight, to struggle against the capitalist system. But after a while, we have to change our perspective. Women must reclaim their role as political agent, as active drivers of capital's transformation. Increasingly, capital responses are shaped by our struggles. And if we apply this perspective, then a lot of things become clear. So if we start, for example, from the struggle of women on maternity, on refusing to make children, or reducing the number of children, or postponing the moment in which to make a child in a part of life towards 40 years, etc. When we look at these, we understand why emigration, why globalization, why a lot of strategies that the capital system put in action to respond to these, to the fact that in the industrialized country there is a birth rate which is falling down, and they need labor force. And so the obligation for capital to go to arrange labor force where they could take. So there is we can see the evolution, for example, of reproduction in the last 50 years from another perspective, and also to see how strong were the struggle of women that were able to, with of course the struggle of the working class, the male working class, were able to oblige capital to a lot of reaction. I think that, so in this vision, now we need to be very cautious towards the concept of patriarchy, since this concept risks keeping today's feminist movement entangled in the framework of women as age eternal victims. Women are victims since thousands of years, from the beginning of humankind, no? Victims of men. And the men are terrible people, and the carnefici, the bad, the monsters, and we are the victims. This doesn't work. This vision doesn't work for many reasons. Many reasons. How, for example, a reason, how can we instill courage and pride in young feminist militants if we assume a political narrative in which women have existed for millennia without power or agency? How can we? And then this concept, if we analyze this concept is very weak. Is very weak historically. Now we have a lot of research on this, and we know, but we have a lot of research on this which contradict this reading. And at the same time, we know too little about human history to claim with certainty that women have been continuously subordinate in every society to this day. There are a lot of research, for example, on pre-colonial indigenous societies, for example, that maintain relatively balanced gender relationships. We have a lot of research now on this. And we have a research that show how it was capitalist colonization that imposed a patriarchal structure on previously more egalitarian communities. So we must be very careful about that, about this point.
So that's so Leopoldina, if you could just wrap up, you know, and make some final.
I finished.
Perfect, perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Are you sure?
Yeah. I finished. I had to say, but I think, but then Donatella will talk about, so we listen. Donatella is very well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a really, really very clear exposition of the Wages for Housework campaign movement, and, you know, just very useful, something we couldn't get from just reading the classic text. So thank you so much for that. So I will now go to our readers. So I will start with Professor Vijay Kumar, who will offer her comments, and then Shraddha, and finally Donatella.
Okay. Thanks, Prabha, and thank you, Leopoldina. It was so wonderful to hear you talk about the larger political context of the Arcana, and it's a huge pleasure for me to be part of this discussion. And I'm also quite intimidated by this company, so I'm excited to share my thoughts. And I'll also say, you know, one of the reasons I was excited about this is that I first encountered your work through Prabha's work. I had been doing research with sex worker activists in India at that time. I was a graduate student, and I had a lot of sort of nebulous ideas that I hadn't found a theoretical vocabulary to describe. And I was coming out of a Marxist sociological kind of perspective, but I hadn't really figured out how to apply that to the experiences of sex workers that I was talking to. So Prabha's work became a huge reference point for me. And then through her work, I kind of found materialist feminism and social reproduction theory and your book. So I also have that copy that Prabha showed of your book. But I also got this one, and it's really very beautiful. So I'm so excited that it's going to be reaching a new generation of feminist readers. So when I first read the book, I spent several days kind of captivated going through it, taking pages and pages of notes. I actually went back to those notes when I was preparing for this discussion today, because it became an anchor point for my understanding of the politics of sex work, sort of a voice in the back of my head. And I have continued to return to it now as I'm writing about social reproduction and sexuality in India. So thank you for creating that space for so many of us. So what I want to do in these comments is explain what I found so powerful in this text. And it may seem like a bit of an idiosyncratic reading because I'm going to focus on the parts of the argument that I found useful in my work on sex worker activists and with sex worker activists. But the book positions sex workers and house workers, you know, both as the nerve center of the overall reproduction process, but also sees sex work as kind of a corollary and particular process of reproduction. So filling in gaps for and complementing domestic labor. And I noticed that in the new version, particularly the new afterword, there's more of a focus on sort of shifts in domestic labor, and you kind of leave further study of sex work to other scholars and activists. So I'll focus more on sort of the relationship between the home and the paid sex market in the original book, because that's been the most generative for my own work. And then I have a couple of more general questions that I'll share at the end. So a central insight of the Arcana is that the spheres of reproduction and production are interrelated, and that the obligation to work marches hand in hand. I think this is a different translation than the earlier one, with the obligation to marry, and that capitalism consists of a direct wage relation to the archetypically male worker and an indirectly wage relation to the house worker or the sex worker. So key to the text is the idea that the value production of the reproductive process is hidden in the shadow of the single wage, represented as non-value and mystified by concepts like love. The effect of this devaluation and invisibilization is ultimately a divided working class. But within the reproductive sphere, you also point to a second sort of hidden division, which is the one between the sex worker and the house worker. There are similarities between the two in that they're both indirectly waged through the client or the husband, and there are differences in that the sex worker is free to sell her labor power for a more kind of bounded time period than the house worker. But this was crucial for me, that even though sex work is practically integrated into all other sectors of the reproductive sphere, and sex work is pursued by housewives, students, factory workers, and service workers, it is in capital's formal interest to keep the sex work complementary and quantitatively secondary to domestic labor in order to force women to continue to reproduce the worker primarily as housewives. So sex work shouldn't reach levels where it comes to threaten housework as the hidden abode of value production. So the fact of sex work is an open secret, to use Swati Shah's concept. Many working husbands, you say, have pretended not to know how their wives rounded up the family's wages to make it to the end of the month. And this also means that it's impossible to imagine, sort of in this discourse, the sex worker as a mother. Coexisting with the increasing entanglement of sex work and domestic labor is the discovery that, as you put it, and this also I think is different in the new translation, is a monster with many heads that takes shape throughout the entire social body, and that we are all prostitutes. This is on page 96. So let me explain now how instructive I found these insights in my own work. I've long been inspired by sex worker mobilizations in India, particularly those that centered the labor of sex work by claiming the vocabulary of the trade union, even though they weren't formally recognized as trade unions by the state. But in my conversations with sex workers within these organizations, not the leaders of the organizations, but sort of the everyday members, I often found that they turned the conversation back to questions of motherhood and economic constraint. So they would say, I do this work for my children, or even insist that they wanted to be identified as mothers before they identified as sex workers. They would emphasize the cost of living in the city, the failure of the breadwinner model to provide for their children, and the inadequacy of wages in factory labor. So for rank and file sex workers, goals were often related to things like housing and children's education, and not necessarily the decriminalization of sex work or the assertion of sex workers' labor rights that leaders emphasized. So one of the organizers I was working with at the time saw these identifications as a kind of conservatism. So saying that claiming motherhood is kind of a bid to respectability or a form of false consciousness, or rejection of the radical potential of sex worker organizing. The insights in the Arcana lead to a different conclusion. And it took me a long time to actually sort of grapple with this. So they explain the unique division of housework and sex work. So the latter serves as a complementary obverse to the former. This complementary role serves not just to make up for the deficits in male workers' sexual and reproductive needs, but also to make up for the deficits in the ability of the male breadwinner to sustain the family because of stagnant wages or the inability to work. In fact, what these sex workers were telling me was that the root of their exploitation was not the conditions of sex work in themselves, but in the general conditions of reproductive labor under capitalism. They were telling me that, as you put it, the only thing that can free us from the labor of prostitution is the united struggle of housewives and prostitutes for the destruction of their unwaged work relationships. This is page 170 in the new version. So I would add that in my recent work, Another way I've seen this manifest is in the intersection of factory work and sex work. So factory workers I've interviewed are constantly aware of the potential of sexual exchange with a supervisor to ease their working conditions or to help meet their household expenses with partners or with husbands. But the threat of sex work serves a disciplinary function. So if factory workers turn fully to and openly to sex work, they face police repression, social ostracization, dehumanization. And so they must keep sex work at least externally secondary to the demands of their labor at the factory and at home. For example, I've talked to some sex workers who take a job as a street vendor or a piece worker as a cover for sex work. So one of the ideological tools of the division of reproductive laborers then is what Gail Peterson called the whore stigma, which serves to discipline workers both in the home and in the paid workplace. So the myth of love that obscures the labor of the housewife accompanies and depends on the dehumanization of the sex worker. So I'll end now with a few questions, two that I've always wanted to ask you and two that come out of my reading of the afterword in the new version of the book. So in the original book, Sexuality is Central. It was really interesting to hear you now talk about sort of imagining sexuality beyond both the domestic labor and the sex work relationship. But I was always left with the question of what kind of labor sex actually entails. The book suggests that the sexual reproduction of the worker is one part of the reproduction of the worker in general. And in this formulation, that the male worker is the one who consumes sex, while the female worker is the one who provides it. But what makes this form of sex socially necessary for the reproduction of the worker? And then in that case, is sexual desire impossible to imagine for the non-directly waged worker under capitalism? Or is sexual desire kind of an ideological tool along with love to hide the labor relations within the family? So a more simplistic way of putting the question is sex ideology, or is there something more to it? Second, the book provides a powerful explanation of why female sexual desire, particularly outside of the heterosexual family, has historically been regarded as a threat to the capitalist order. So we have here kind of a powerful understanding of why, for example, lesbian desire is stigmatized. But could we extend this analysis to the male-female gender binary more generally? Because if we could then explain, for example, one of the ways that transgender rights have become a site of moral panic. And I'd love to hear you sort of speak more about that. Okay, so a third question is about the analysis of the post-pandemic world that you provide in the afterword. So I was deeply compelled by your discussion of the ways that the boundaries of the reproductive and productive spheres have shifted, particularly through the rise of digital technology and the aftermath of the pandemic. You show us how even as feminist movements have pushed for a restructuring of the division of labor within the family, there are always new ways to maintain the exploitation of reproductive laborers, including new technologies of procreation or higher levels of investment in children. You made me think of the pronatalist movement exemplified by Elon Musk and his 14 children or however many there are. And while you note the expansion of family forms and forms of queer kinship, you're careful not to romanticize these in themselves, noting that the family continues to be the basis of the capitalist economy, even if it, to some extent, no longer exists. So it seemed after the pandemic that perhaps the crisis of reproduction had reached a breaking point. There was a sense of feminist possibility in the ways that the contradictions of patriarchal capitalism were so brutally exposed. And yet it seems, at least from where I'm sitting in the US, that instead of sort of taking up that possibility, we've ended up with kind of a reassertion of the dynamics that you documented, in the original version of this book. Recently, Mark Zuckerberg said that Meta was developing AI friends to make up for the loneliness crisis in the aftermath of the pandemic. And on the center left in the US, we've seen calls for universal childcare grow increasingly central. But as you point out so powerfully, they can't address women's exploitation at its root. It's kind of a strategic but not an end goal. So what is your assessment of the present political conjuncture? And particularly in relation to the pandemic, which exposed the devaluation of reproductive labor and the crisis of reproduction, how can feminists be taking up that potential? Or why have we not been as successful as we could be in taking up that potential? Finally, I was very taken with your analysis, and I think I didn't notice this the first time I read the book, of the potential of what you call proto-political acts. So individual forms of refusal in the rejection of the nuclear family form or the refusal to do housework. And you see domestic work as having radically subversive potential. This is on page 271. But these individual refusals, when they're combined with kind of racial and class histories of mobilization, can also reinforce patriarchal forms. So I'm thinking of the rise of the trad wife, fueled by social media influencers in the US. Some have seen that as a way that white women are rejecting what you'd call kind of extra domestic work or the paid workforce. But it also bolsters a new idealization of the white male breadwinner and is premised on a further exploitation of working class women of color. So what does it take to make the proto-political political rather than simply reinstating an idealization of the home as the site of love? So to end, I will come back to what I've been thinking about in relation to some of the sex worker organizations I know in India, because it seems to me that maybe one answer to that question is in their work. Sex worker mobilizations are really well positioned to see clearly the contradictions of the division of housework and sex work, and the division or the invisibilization of reproductive work. They sort of see that more clearly than others. And sex worker activists are at the forefront of understanding, for example, the potentialities of technology and the threats it might pose. They understand that, in your words, we are all prostitutes. And there does seem to be a radical potential in that. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to you.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Gauri. So we move next to Shraddha.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Firstly, thank you so much, Professor Prabha, for letting me do this today and be part of this gathering, and Professor Leopoldina for this wonderful book. And obviously, your introduction was covering so much of length and breadth of the issues that, I don't know how much I will be able to comment on. My thoughts are emerging from my own position in my research, and I'm sorry if there are any repetitions from your own speech or from Dr. Gauri's comments. So the book reiterates the need and the reasons to value domestic work and housework as productive work, which was missing from the original Marxian analysis, and even the other scholars who were writing at that time. We have also referred to quotes from Adam Smith that time. So you kind of hit on that times. And it also very importantly highlight the neglect of paid domestic work and sex work in the economic analysis, along with catering to material needs. The provision of immaterial needs gains prominence in your work. The analysis of sexual reproduction of labor, prostitution, or sex work. So the lens of class relations is very insightful. In fact, it would be interesting to know more about your choice of usage of the words prostitution and sex work. In fact, you have a footnote in, I think, on page 37 or so. I'll be curious to know more about this. You also highlight how capitalism wants redemption of sex work as it caters to immaterial needs without any obligation to domestic work. So I think Dr. Gauri also mentioned about this line, obligation to work is tied to the obligation to marry. So how marriage is central to the framework. You also talk about how scholars have also seen redemption of sex work despite the earning potential of the sector. You have given us example of Vietnamese sex workers in that sense, and how we have at length discussed how several proletarian families actually depend on sex work, and you discussed how they combine it with other forms of paid work to meet the to survive the economic crisis. Still, the system sees it as a like we see the contradiction that it is a wage labor, but outside the so-called legal domain. The third most important feature of your writing I found was about class composition. You, in your introduction, also you spoke at length about this. Like in the traditional analysis, focus more on the white male working person, but it's pertinent to look at the race, class, and gender relations. Especially the struggles of women against capitalism is different from struggles of men for capitalism. Over time, we have seen these struggles being around birth rates, wages for housework campaign that you've discussed at length, or even shortening of a work day, like you mentioned about double burden. So all these aspects. Now, these are very important to acknowledge, as society can be graded on several aspects, which actually affect the access to resources. Like later in your book, you talk about technology. In the real parlance, the technology is not equally accessible. So when we talk about how capitalism is affected by technology, that can have differential aspects. For instance, in India, caste plays an important role in defining inequalities. So that is, I found a very insightful portion of your book. Next, I would like to talk about women engaging in paid work, especially in factories, and earning lesser than men. That reiterates their position in the reserve army and being the dependent status of men. This also leads us to think about need to analyze family in the Marxian framework. You pointed out the role of children in reserve army discussion, or even elderly, like how they are like not productive labor in that sense. So how need to visualize family needs. There's a need to visualize family in a greater landscape. Then lastly, your discussion on contemporary development is also so crucial, like especially in terms of innovation of work and workplace in the digitalized world. Now the notion of work and the workplace is so different with home-based work and work from home. So how do we see this? And the implication on technology on reproduction is like, it's varied. Like it's also impacting the birth process and the social reproduction. Like we have literature on technology and domestic work. So it's like we've shown us how different things are changing. Also, the acknowledgement of migrant domestic worker is also very important in the contemporary discussion of social reproduction. However, I have some points that I wish to discuss further with you. First is about role of men, marriage, and patriarchy. You touched upon patriarchy, but we'll talk about it later. So when I talk about patriarchy, it's not to disregard the agency of women, but to acknowledge, I would say, that there are limits to it. So when we say that there is a patriarchal system existing, it's not that women don't find ways to negotiate through, but there are limits to those. So existence of patriarchal systems outside capital has been also discussed. Like Nancy Falbray has this book, Rise and Fall of Patriarchal Systems, where she looks at patriarchy in other modes of production other than capital. And then I found a very interesting piece written by Claudia von Wellhoff. I don't know if I pronounce it correct. So the paper is titled "No Critique of Capitalism Without Critique of Patriarchy." So right now we see more of men as just the mediator between capital and role of women. So how we go beyond it. Similarly, we have histories of sex work around the world, going to like I don't know how many centuries. So how we how these relations changed with capitalism, that would be interesting to know. Secondly, how we see the role of the state. With capitalism going into crisis, the state bears the onus of maintaining social reproduction with education, health, nutrition. But as a lot of you have mentioned, you also mentioned, there's a growing privatization of these aspects of education, health. So how do we see the role of the state? So there's an interesting point in the book where you talk about that capitalism needs full employment. So here the full employment means that no woman should be unmarried. So how, and we see in various societies how state persists on heterosexual marriages too. So how we go about this. We can also think about some works on how family policies have been going around. There's some literature on familialism. So how state formulate policies that place greater roles to families and the reproductive roles within families. Again, linking to patriarchy and the role men play, who holds the decision-making positions in businesses, in states. So in these aspects, increasing violence against women, the hit on the reproductive rights of women, how do we go about all these aspects? I'm also curious to know how we think about economies that are sectorally very different. Like there would be economies with greater agrarian societies, with greater service sector societies. So how we look around it, and along with these, like I'm also very much along these things, I was also thinking about struggles of paid domestic workers to be identified as legit workers. That in India, at least, it's still a long drawn struggle along with other kinds of these things. And lastly, about who leads the movement, like you pointed about class composition. Just to give you an example, in Indian context, there's a lot of there has been acknowledgement that unions are mainly male dominated. So in that sense, the role of women in that sense, I think I'll stop here and would like to receive your response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Shraddha. So next we go to Donatella.
Thank you, Prabha. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you for,
yes.
Right. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to come together to discuss this groundbreaking feminist text. And in fact, I wonder, how does one speak about such a classic? So I thought of starting with a personal note. I first came across l'Arcano when I was studying law at university in Italy, not because it was part of the curriculum, unfortunately, but because I was lucky to read it in the context of a feminist reading group I was part of. And I can't tell you what a revelation reading it was, as with my other colleagues, not only because it enabled me to make sense of my own position as a young woman growing up in a very patriarchal southern Italian town, whose people, including myself, aspired to catch up with the industrial or modernized North. But also because it enabled me to start approaching law very differently from what I was being taught at uni. And of course, this is a retelling in hindsight. Despite that, reading l'Arcano was the moment when, for me, law's emancipatory potential began to be tainted by an understanding of the role that it has played and continues to play in the reproduction of socioeconomic inequalities and planetary injustices. It became clear to me that without centering this role in our analysis, and here I speak as a scholar of law and political economy, there can be no progressive or emancipatory future. So for enabling me to start on this journey and for the incredible generosity and inspiration of your feminist praxis, I want to thank you, Leopoldina. But what I'd like to do with the time I have is to reflect on the renewed significance that this text has, not only for scholars of law and political economy, but for the possibility of thinking about transnational feminist struggles at this present juncture. And I will end, as my colleagues did, with some questions about the afterword. The three insights I want to reflect on revolve around the relationship between social reproduction and value. And it's interesting that you've just said that that was not your original concern, right? The first insight is your critique of the separation between the sphere of production, where goods and services are produced, and that of social reproduction, where labor power is produced and reproduced, for the purpose of generating surplus value and enabling capital accumulation. Now, of course, your work shows that this separation is not neutral. Indeed, it made little sense to populations in the majority world, but in fact, it needs to be constantly performed through various processes and techniques, including law. And we can think of the many ways in which law has contributed and still contributes to performing this separation. For example, in international economic law, the field I'm most familiar with, by sanctioning what realm we can consider economic and what we can consider social, what sphere attracts legal entitlement and what doesn't, what is productive and what is unproductive labor, and so on and so forth. Now, this point connects to the second powerful insight that I take from your work, and that's about both the value producing quality of social reproductive work, domestic and sex work, and also the need for capital to keep this quality hidden, so to extract as much surplus value as possible, regardless, as you just said, of who actually performs this kind of labor. Because, as you put it, and here I'm quoting, capital doesn't care who does reproductive work, as long as this labor can go unpaid or paid as little as possible, end of quote. And here we come to the third insight, which I take from the chapter on the workers' history of reproduction. And that's about the role the social divisions and hierarchies play in processes of labor stratification on the one hand, and capital accumulation on the other. Stratification, you say, is an essential condition for political command and control. As you point out, Marx disregarded how the liberation process of some sections proceeded at the expense of the liberation of others, pointing to a crucial problem with various readings of capital history, not just Marxist, but also developmentalist, liberal feminist. And the problem is that, and I quote, the result of the different processes of liberation among classes, among sections of the working class, are defined as vestiges of pre-capitalist relations that capitalism would eliminate progressively. As you argue, an important limitation with this interpretation is a lack of awareness that the working class was born with deep internal divisions, and the terrain of class composition has itself been a terrain of struggle. Again, we can think of the role that law has played since colonial times in enabling historically and geographically contingent forms of labor invisibilization and devaluation, from international trade and investment law, finance, family, tax, equality, immigration, company, trust, and of course labor law, and so on and so forth. But the point your work brings to the fore is the centrality for value extraction and capital accumulation on a global scale of not only domestic labor, which remains essential, but also of other forms of unpaid and devalued labor, including informal and informalized labor, of which much is migrant. So I come to the two broad questions I have about the transformations you have pointed to in the afterword that concern these insights. The first is in relation to the argument you make, or that I understood you making, about the center of gravity for the production of value having shifted from the sphere of production to that of reproduction, which you say is dominant today. Your work on digital technologies has been really important in this respect, because it has shown the double value extraction that happens in households through production of data and user-generated content the tech company then appropriate. But I wonder if you could expand on what's at stake in saying that reproduction has become the dominant sphere for capital, as it is the sphere where, and I quote, the most surplus value has come to be directly extracted. That's page 250. Now, in one sense, we know this has always been the case because it is the site where labor power gets produced and reproduced. But I'm asking this question because the realm of commodity production still appears to be a huge site of surplus value generation. The rush for critical minerals characterizing transition economies and Green New Deals is one example. The sale of data we produce in the home, which is then used to create demand for commodity, is another. And financialization processes that enable households with sufficient income to demand and buy more commodities is yet another one. So I've been wondering whether by saying that most surplus value is directly extracted from reproduction, you're aligning yourself with debates about surplus populations. That is, populations that are at times irrelevant to the generation of surplus value, even though they experience the violence of capitalism. So basically, you're saying that the production of commodities other than data has become less relevant on a global scale. But even so, my question is whether by ascribing more strategic relevance to one sphere over the other, which your work has done much to problematize, we risk undermining the tracing of connections between production and reproduction transnationally, of which global value care chains is just one illustration, and also the possibility of connecting struggles transnationally, a point to which I will return shortly. Because it also occurred to me that the point about the strategic relevance of social reproduction might have something to do with what's happening to processes of subjectivation of household members, mainly in post-Fordist economies. As you point out, capital enters directly into our homes, attempting to shape consciousness. For example, the data we produce, enabling capital to extract value, is also used by capital in states to shape our behavior as consumers and as citizens. Also, work on financialization has made a similar point, showing how household members, have become more invested in the doing well of financial assets, like pension funds. So I wonder whether this different quality in the exercise of more direct power by capital and the state is what's at stake when you point to the increasing significance of the reproductive sphere. As you've argued, reproduction is and has always been the site where differences and talents are cultivated alongside labor power. So are you pointing to it, social reproduction, becoming a site of more intense struggle against capital? And if so, then the question is, how do we think, which you pointed to at the very end of your introduction, how do we think of subversion today in the context of those competing subjectivities that your work on digital tech has explored? For example, you've pointed to individualism and desensitization, and at the same time, the fact that there is increasing awareness by all household members that the terrain of social reproduction is being degraded, despite and perhaps because more domestic labor is done by members other than the housewife, and of course because the state and state support is withering away, but also and importantly, because the outsourcing of this labor has been made possible thanks to the colonial structuring of our world economy. So keeping in mind these spatial temporal connections that make up our global economy, and this is my second question, I wonder if you could help us think about points of pressure, choke points, on which to intervene to enable more subversive subjectivities to emerge and connect in transnational struggles. What do I mean by this? I agree with you that trying to raise the bar of needs and requirements is really important. So we could think of demands on states and institutions in the spirit of the provocation, the wages for and against housework brought to capital and the state. For example, we could articulate demands for locally designed and administered infrastructures that combine income, wage, social and environmental support. Within international economic law, I can certainly think of demands to roll back the extensive legal entitlements the capital has been provided with. So, all of this is absolutely important to reappropriate part of the wealth we have produced. And that's a starting point, because the aim is transforming the way we produce. As you say, we need to abolish reproductive labor as labor for capital. And so my question is, how do we think, or how do we do this in ways that are not complicit with states, particularly powerful ones, gesturing towards satisfying our demands by relying on the colonial restructuring of the global economy that continues to drain and transfer value from global south to global north populations? Indeed, we are more aware today that welfare achievements in former post-Fordist economies have happened also because of the value transfer that racial capitalism has enabled. Of course, this is not to downplay the importance of past struggles, but to bring the discussion back to your point about labor stratification, which is very much at play in the current geopolitical moment, where we look at the rush for critical minerals or the current trade wars that will hit social reproduction and will hit it hard, and will potentially heighten the individualistic and desensitization qualities that you've talked about. So to conclude, what kind of demands, initiatives, legal and otherwise, might we think of that, starting from the acknowledgement that we inhabit very different positions with regard to state resources, for example, regarding welfare? So what kind of initiatives can we think of that have the potential to make transnational solidarities more rather than less possible? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I know we are out of time, but this is such a rich text that we will carry on and we'll understand if people have to leave. So I think we'll give Leopoldina a chance to respond to what the readers have said. There's a vast variety of questions she can pick and choose, and then we'll open up for Q&As. But over to you, Leopoldina.
Thank you. I'm really by a lot of points, very interesting, raised by Donatella, by Gauri, and by Radha. I begin with Gauri. There is I want to take a point in respect to her reflection. That as she noticed very well, I didn't pick up in the afterward in the Arcana the question of the struggles about about prostitution, because I believe we know too few internationally about that. For example, we don't know very much the role of the platforms in respect to sexual work, how it is restructured, how women are paid, how profit they do about that. We don't know sufficiently about how sexuality has been transformed. After the struggles in the 70s, in which women discovered the right to orgasm, and began to negotiate with men their satisfaction. This this mass behavior, proto-political, began a series of other kind of behavior by men, by capital. Capital responded with porn, online porn, virtual pornography, etc., etc. So there are, my impression is that we needed to study more, to know more, to map more the struggles in order to understand really what has happened in these 50 years about sex work, sexuality, and etc., and capital response. About Shraddha. Shraddha did raise a lot of points. I pick only, we don't have time, I think, to discuss really much of them, but the point that the unions are male dominated, this is not only in India, this is everywhere. Maybe now in Italy, in all the industrialized countries, there are more women, but the number is always very limited, because this is related to the fact that women with a double work don't have time to organize, to participate in the organization of struggles, also in the workplace. And this is connected also to the question that Gauri posed about the trad wife. No, the trad wife are the response. This is and Trump. How could Trump come out? Think about all the limitation of the policy by Democrats, etc. This is the feminist movement refused to assume the perspective of wage for housework, because they said no, this institutionalized the housework, etc. We cannot, and they continue to to deny this contradiction for women of the double work. And the trad wife are the result of this. A lot of women, why they should go out and do two works for one wage. They try to stay at home, and this is the answer. This is the equality of exploitation is not attractive to a lot of women, because it is, we offered, not we, but the left offered too few to women. And this is the result of a terrible mistake that they did politically, and the right is the result of their mistakes. So there would be many things to say also on Gauri. She rightly posed a lot of points, very interesting, but I can say when in the 72, I think in Berlin, in the Freie Universität, I said that women, we are all children, daughter of prostitutes, because this is the history the historical reality in which we are, because each of us has some ancestor that was a prostitute, because there was an immense number of women that were prostitutes in the medieval age and after. So, and no, because there was this capitalist strategy to separate on the respectability, the house workers from the prostitutes. That this implicates a lot of things. The implicates that now, for example, we never talked about that, but the sex workers need to polish the money they gain from the stigma, the social stigma, and we must help these take off this stigma for the money they have, because this stigma is has the meaning to say women cannot have the right to have the money, cannot have these. When they have, they must be punished with the social exclusion. This is the only reason for which this, but this makes sex workers very, in a situation very terrible, and we must help in this. There is no other, so we should have much more time to go through all these. Donatella, you raise also so many interesting points that maybe I pick up one. I pick up only one, the state, the fact that we should, as Prabha documented in her article about this wage for housework that women receive in some states in India, the fact that the Indian state recognized the value of housework. And this should be something that we must learn to make circulate also in all the industrialized countries. So the state, we must fight to make the state recognize the value of domestic labor, the value of the reproduction sphere, because this is the only, I think, real strategy that women in this moment can express to assure peace, because a state which is involved in the recognition of value of domestic labor cannot be a state that make war, destroy the result of the domestic labor of our women and the women in the state. So it is the only guarantee, I think, to implicate the state in this, among the goals of the state, the fundamental goals such as the security of the population, etc., the health, the education, but very much the value of the reproduction sphere. This should be one of our objectives. So I would conclude here. We should have another another meeting to discuss really, because I had very profound comments that I would like, maybe I can write to Worry, to Shraddha, and to Donatella to be in conversation, because really I feel that you all point many interesting things. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Prabha for inviting me, and to all of you for being together with this discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leopoldina. I think what I'd invite all of you is to, unless someone wants to make an intervention, is to write to Leopoldina, and and as she rightly has advised, we should meet again to converse and strategize more. So, is there anybody who wants to say anything at this point, or? You've all been very patient in the audience. Any quick thoughts? No. Okay. Well, so thank you, Leopoldina, once again for your immensely brilliant work and for continuing to inspire us. So we are taking away a lot from your work, and we'll continue to be in conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you to you, Prabha, and Donatella, Gauri, Shraddha, and all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leopoldina. Thank you, Prabha.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.
Bye.